Hello there, live from Ramacro. This is the Lloyd Evans channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the Bible and Bible prophecy. Just how reliable is Bible prophecy? Of course, the Christian fundamentalist position is that the Bible is 100% reliable. But I'm interested today in drilling down into specific claims made by the Bible and whether it can be objectively said that they came true historically. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Josh Bowen, who holds a PhD in Assyriology and various qualifications in religion, the Old Testament, and Near Eastern studies. Dr. Bowen is also author of both volumes of The Atheist's Guide to the Old Testament. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Bowen.
Oh, no, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, yeah, this is a really, I think, crucial subject because, I obviously come from a Christian fundamentalist background, and I know you come from a Christian background as well. And it's something that, is a matter of quite some pride when you are a believer that, here's a book that has this fabulous track record of getting it right when it comes to various predictions about the unfolding of ancient history. In fact, just to kind of give us a little bit of context, I've prepared a clip of governing body member David Splain. He's, one of the governing body members of Jehovah's Witnesses, making some very interesting comments along those lines. So let's just take a look.
According to a dictionary, a witness is someone who has personal knowledge of something. So how can we be witnesses of Jehovah? What personal knowledge do we have of his activities? Well, first of all, we can testify to the fact that Jehovah can see into the future. And when he does that, he's right 100% of the time. And second, we know that no one can prevent what Jehovah foresees from coming true. All of Jehovah's prophecies come true. Fighters against God will never prevail. We serve the God of true prophecy, and what he foretells comes to be.
So, Bible prophecy right 100% of the time. Would you concur with that, Dr. Bowen?
Unfortunately not, no.
Okay.
No. And I have to say that I always do, and I probably shouldn't, but I always do get a kick out of just the word Jehovah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've covered this any number of times, but how it's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew, the word itself.
Yeah.
It's just funny to me.
It is, yeah. It's kind of a Frankenstein's monster of a word that dates from sort of the Middle Ages, ironically from the Catholic priesthood, considering how averse to Catholicism Jehovah's Witnesses are. But because it became so popular and right. was the word used to name God in the King James Version, that's the name that stuck.
It
even
just
though
sticks.
There's a far better word, Yahweh, that scholars typically use, but Jehovah's Witnesses, it's their favorite toy. It's
their thing,
literally in their name. Yeah. So, okay. So I've decided to structure this in kind of I'm trying to be as fair as possible to the fundamentalist position. I'm actually going to start with some examples that fundamentalists or Christian believers would point to in favor of the Bible being a book of prophecy. And I'm going to start with one in Isaiah chapter 44, verses 27 and 28. I don't know whether you'll be jealous of my Bible, Dr. Bowen, but it is a complete parallel Bible. So it's a bit of a beast, and it allows me to read 4 different versions simultaneously. So 27 and 28, I'm going to start with, which version do you prefer?
I always upset people when they ask me that. Probably not you, but I really like the NIV.
Okay.
We react strongly to that sometimes. You know, you
I
can't.
don't have it here.
No.
Out of
like-
New Revised Standard,
Yeah.
Revised English, New American, and New Jerusalem, which one should I use?
Yeah, they're all going to be just great, whichever one.
Okay.
You want.
I'll do New Revised Standard. That could have gone more smoothly. Never mind. So Isaiah 44:27, who says to the deep, be dry, I will dry up your waters. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall carry out all my purpose. And who says of Jerusalem, it shall be rebuilt, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. So the claim made by Jehovah's Witnesses is that 200 years in advance, the prophet Isaiah predicted by name the conqueror of Babylon, and even the strategy that he would use to conquer Babylon, namely diverting the river Euphrates. I've come to learn that that's just simply not true, because the book of Isaiah was written not in one go by a literal dude named Isaiah, but over many centuries. And the verses in Isaiah 44 were almost certainly added after the fact. Would that be sort of a fair position?
Yeah, definitely. And the same sorts of things I think are true when you read other prophetic texts. And it's always interesting to me to hear people that fall into a more fundamentalist camp, like I used to be for 26 years, reacting to that sort of thing. Even some of my old professors at seminary, there's such a strong reaction to the single authorship of the book of Isaiah, but it's for this reason, right? Because you have to have single authorship that predates these things in order for those prophecies to hold. So it doesn't surprise me that there's that strong reaction. But yes, I mean, Isaiah's multiple authorship, at least two. Most scholars, I think, would say three. First Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. So yeah, I mean, the same thing is true with something like the book of Daniel. It's it's more complicated than this. It was written beforehand, and the prophecies all came true. Slightly more complex.
Indeed. And it's not even like, because if I were watching this as a believer, I'd be thinking, well, you're just saying that as someone who's literally written two books called The Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. You're just saying that as an atheist, but this is just a mainstream scholarly view that's held by theist scholars as well, isn't it? That Isaiah had multiple authors. Yeah.
I mean, I always talk about this. In the department at Johns Hopkins where I got my PhD, I'd say half that I know of the faculty in the Near Eastern Studies department identified as Christian. And so these sorts of things just never came up because they're sort of foundational, like that. They're understood to be the case because of the data.
Yeah.
It's...
Okay. Thank you. Next example that is again a favorite among Jehovah's Witnesses. I actually embarrassingly remember even including this in a public talk. When I say public talk, I used to be obviously a speaker for Jehovah's Witnesses, and I used to get assigned to go to different congregations, and there was like a selection of talks that I would give, and one of them was on Bible prophecy. And I remember giving one, and I would go on about Babylon. So Isaiah 13:19 and 20 says, "And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Arabs will not pitch their tents there. Shepherds will not make their flocks lie down there." So, you will have multiple Jehovah's Witness publications with images of the ruins of Babylon, and they'll make the point that Babylon is indeed desolate, or the city that we recognize as being, the seat of the Babylonian Empire. is ruins. And I used to show pictures of a palace that was actually built there by Saddam Hussein, and which actually got, I think, not destroyed, but it was basically severely damaged during the during I think the Second Iraq War, and American troops were using it for as part of their camp, and it's no longer habitable, even the palace that Saddam Hussein built there. And so I would argue, this is slam dunk evidence of Bible prophecy. First of all, I've done some digging on this, and there's actually a kind of a footprint to the ancient city of Babylon, and if you look on Google Earth, I'm not convinced that there is no one living in that area. It seems to be a fairly reasonably habited area. And secondly, even if we were to grant that no one's living there, if you're throwing around judgments against city after city after city, give it a few thousand years, and one of them's going to come good eventually. And that's kind of my position when it comes to Babylon. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, we're coming at this trying to critique this, very fundamentalist interpretive model of biblical prophecy, and I think in some ways it's probably not only fundamentalists that hold to it, but I think the understanding of this is much more nuanced, even for people that would adhere to evangelicalism today. Coming at texts like we're talking about here and what we're going to be talking about later, these have a particular genre. So even people that hold to Christianity, even evangelicals, I think, that hold to Christianity, would be very flexible or willing to flex on these types of things because of the nature of the genre of the text. And I think because of that, it allows maybe a more progressive Christian to be able to say, yeah, okay, here this oracle against this nation, maybe it's meant to be a little hyperbolic. Maybe it's meant to be like battle cry, or stirring the troops, or whatever.
I'm going to really mess you up, sort of language. Yeah.
And so I guess I'm probably in the same place that you are in this, in that my goal is to move people away from that. Like, step one for me is move them away from that end of the spectrum, that fundamentalist end of the spectrum. Because if I can get you away from there, now you're open a little bit to, hey, maybe all these passages that talk about who I should hate and how slavery is okay. Like maybe I don't have to adhere to those so much. Maybe there's another way to look at these. So
yeah. Maybe when God's jumping up and down about gay people, maybe we should treat that in the same way as God jumping up and down pronouncing destruction against various cities, countries, you name it. And the other one, I don't really need to look it up. We were talking about it briefly off air. The 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9, which Jehovah's Witnesses believe points to 29 CE or AD as heralding the appearance of the Messiah. So the argument they make is, hey, if you take this period of time and you apply this interpretation, it's going to take you to 29 AD, and wouldn't you know, that's when Jesus got baptized? Or
crazy, right?
I think that's how they apply it. So I've already done a video on this. Unfortunately, Tibor can't show the thumbnail, whether he's gracious or not, because this is a live stream. But I'd be fair in saying that that actually was a prophecy, not about Jesus Christ, but about a different Messiah, the high priest in Jerusalem during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes the first.
Yeah, I mean, there has been much ink spilt over Daniel 9:24-27, and specifically how to engage with it. So, somebody like Lester Graby wrote an article talking about chronography and how they use these types of ancient periodizations. And so what is the 490 years? How would they have understood it? How is this in and of itself intertextuality, trying to make sense of Leviticus 26 and what we see in Jeremiah concerning the 70 years that are supposed to be at Babylonian captivity, and then trying to reconcile that and maybe to utilize Leviticus 26 where it says, I'll punish you 7 times more for your sins. And so then you get the 70 years times 7. And that explains why these people much, much later are looking back and sort of scratching their heads and going, isn't this all supposed to be over by now? So for me, apocalyptic literature, which is what the book of Daniel is, and I will keep this very brief because I know you don't want to talk about something else.
You don't have to keep it brief. I mean, to be honest, we've rattled through the examples of quote unquote success already. So let's labor on that last one, right, and then we'll move to the examples of failures. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. But yeah, I mean, apocalyptic literature is written very often in a sort of ambiguous way, right? They attempt to write it with language that allows for flexibility in interpretation. And so that's not always the case, right? It does seem like at times they get more precise, particularly in Daniel, particularly in certain chapters. And it sort of tips their hand looking at it from our perspective as to what they were actually talking about. And so when you look at the prophecies or the visions in chapters 7 and 8, and here in 9, and then in 10 through 12, there's a very clear thread that runs through them all. Sometimes it's explicitly stated, and sometimes it's just alluded to through language, certain lexemes or particular vocabulary. But they all refer to Greece as the final kingdom before the kingdom of God comes. And specifically, as you get later in the book, to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And so that's the real issue that you face when you're trying to interpret something like Daniel 9 as, this prophecy about, I think it was Harold Hoehner that wrote this book, and I can see the cover, but I can't remember the title. But he's making this, I think that's who did it, making this, showing how it's actually leading down to the day. Or I think Sir Robert Anderson also did something similar, The Coming Prince. But again, you really you sort of just have to step over the fact that the book is being very specific, that it's Greece. It's not even Rome. Right, it's specifically Greece and Antiochus IV, which is why, and I'll be quiet, but it's why later in Second Esdras, you have the writer looking back to Daniel and saying, "Yeah, our brother Daniel, thought that this prophecy was about Greece, but he wasn't really given to fully understand God's revelation. But now I'm going to tell you." What it's
Sorry,
really
where does it say that?
In Second Esdras.
So an apocryphal, is it an apocryphal book?
Yeah, and but again, they're writing later, realizing that shit, it can't be Greece because there's this other kingdom, Rome.
Yeah. Give us a moment. We're figuring this out. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and this is why very early on, writers like Porphyry were looking at the book of Daniel and saying, maybe we shouldn't be understanding it quite the way that those writers that put it together were hoping that we would look at it, because it's a text that's put together much later, after the fact.
Yeah, I thank you for summing that up, and thank you for correcting me as well. It wasn't the first Epiphanies; it was the fourth. I think Dr. Richard Carrier made the very good point as well when I spoke to him about the Book of Daniel, which, let's face it, is basically a forgery in that it was, it wasn't written by Daniel. It's written basically trying to set up the character of this prophet who is basically based on a non-Israelite kind of legend. But he made the point that Daniel 11 and the King of the North, King of the South, it gets more accurate in the period in which it's being written, and less accurate kind of before and after, to the point where they make predictions about Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes and his death that don't come true. So,
I give an example, because I have a chapter on the dating of the Book of Daniel in Volume 1, and I kind of give the example of, if we found a document that was purported to have been written by Thomas Jefferson, and when he wrote, we're reading through this thing that's supposed to be by Thomas Jefferson, and it says, brother will rise up against brother, the North against the South, and will fight. And then after this war, there will be a great revolution where, the country fights off the foe to the east. Like, we would look at that and we would say, should he be getting the Civil War and the Revolutionary War wrong? Like the order? But then if it said, but in 2016, there will come a race between the man of the tower and the senator from New York, and they will have a bitter rivalry. The man of the tower will have no political experience, and having gone through so many.
You'd be saying, when was this found exactly? Yeah.
And so you would say, well, wait a minute, there's all this detail about the 2016 race, but then at the end, if it said, but take heart, O nation, God will not allow the man of the tower, he of the orange, to step into the Oval Office or whatever. Like, he will come back and allow the senator to win or something. Like, we would know, okay, so it's not written way back here. It's written here during 2016, but we know that it couldn't have been written after the election because it says that Trump won't win. And so we'd be able to date it fairly precisely. And that's what we have with the Book of Daniel, is we have these, the stuff that's supposed to be around the time of Daniel, he gets a lot of stuff wrong, stuff that you wouldn't expect him to get wrong. But then down toward, the reign of Antiochus the Fourth, you're like, oh man, like, he's talking about who's getting married and like movements of the North and the South. And it gets really, really accurate from what we know from from history. But then there in verse 40, boy, it starts to just go awry. And so that's why there's such precision that you can see, like, okay, it's written in, such and such in 165 or 164, this is when this is, but that's why it's the same sort of principle. So I think those are important things to recognize, just, I'm sure, like Dr. Curry was saying.
Absolutely. So thank you. I'm trying to kind of reach back into my past, my Jehovah's Witness past, and bring forward these examples, which actually get repeated in various video propaganda produced by Jehovah's Witnesses as kind of proof texts regarding Bible accuracy. But now we're going to go to texts that Jehovah's Witnesses don't tend to look at. And I'm going to start off with Isaiah 17, verse 1, which in the New Revised Standard Version says, an oracle concerning Damascus. See, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. So this is what I mean about kind of throwing around kind of denunciations and predictions of destruction. If we're going to take seriously the one at Babylon and say, well, that came true, what do we make of this? Because, anyone who knows anything about Syria will know that Damascus is literally the capital. And even though the country's had an awful lot of political and military chaos over recent years, it's still very much not in ruins and a functioning city.
Yeah, I mean, I walked around in it twice in 2010, I think, before the Civil War. So, yeah, definitely still there.
It's still there. You've checked.
Yeah, I checked.
Okay, but thank you for
went
that.
over there and went.
I was there last time I was there, so yeah. Okay, brilliant. Now I'm challenging myself. This is one of those it's hard to find. Bear with me, especially in a big, thick Bible like this. But it's.
I see. This is where my fundamentalist upbringing really serves me well, because my grandfather used to have me. He had me memorize and repeat back as fast as I could the 66 books, but forwards and backwards.
Yeah.
I don't think I can do it backwards anymore, but I can do it forwards still pretty quick.
We learned a little ditty: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Listen to me, and I'll carry on. Acts, Romans, Corinthians 1 and 2, Galatians and Ephesians. Short of us, we used to learn that, but not so much about the Old Testament. We kind of gave up with that one.
Did you guys have sword drills like that? Did you guys have sword drills where you were when you were growing up, where you take your Bible and you hold it up like this and they say, Ephesians chapter 5 verse 6, and everybody goes Ephesians chapter 5 verse 6, and they say, go or whatever, and you flip open and whoever stands up with it and says the first word first, and if they got to the right verse,
we didn't do that. We didn't do that, but I did have an Armageddon drill once, if that kind of...
That makes up for it.
Yeah, that makes up for it, yeah. I won't go into that because my viewers know all about it, and I've spoken about it too many times. Zephaniah 2, verse 4, in the New Revised Standard Version, says, "For Gaza shall be deserted, and Ashkelon shall become a desolation. Ashdod's people shall be driven out at noon, and Ekron shall be uprooted." Again, not a trouble-free part of the world, but I think we can all objectively agree that Gaza is populated.
And I think this is a good place probably for people to recognize what genre of text we're dealing with when we talk about these types of passages. And John Collins has a really good piece on this. But these are things called the oracles against the nations, right? This type of genres. A lot of times the nation of Israel is sort of pre-battle, or just the prophets are just sort of railing against their neighbors, and there are different ways that this gets used, but it's just sort of looking around at the nations around them and just talking smack, right? And again, different reasons that they might do it, but you just see this in various passages. And so I think being able to recognize that, and as you say, if you're going to take one passage and say, here we go, here's one that works, well, then you got to take all the rest, right? You can't just pick and choose which ones you want. So
if you're going to throw around, as I said, enough denunciations, eventually one of them will come true.
That's right. Throw it up against the wall and see what prophecy sticks,
Yeah, exactly. So the next one, and this is actually kind of the final one, although it's quite an interesting kind of story in that one prediction kind of morphs into another one. And this is something that I know you've written a lot about and studied an awful lot in your academic pursuits, but Tyre. So Ezekiel 26 verse 14 is my favorite. I will make you a bare rock. You shall be a place for spreading nets. You shall never again be rebuilt. For I, the Lord, have spoken, says the Lord God. So, very vivid language. You know, when you imagine a bare rock, you're imagining absolute, utter desolation. This is going to be a place where fishermen are going to dry their nets. It's never going to be rebuilt. And yet, I promise you, if you go on, like, you can do like walking tour videos on YouTube. People do like, I personally couldn't imagine finding that sort of thing interesting, but they literally walk around places with a camera, and you can watch videos of people walking around Tyre. Again, it's very much there, and it's very much not desolate or like a smooth stone or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. And this is one of those prophecies, I think, that is more problematic, because even though it does fit into the genre of oracles against the nations, and if you look at the structure of the book of Ezekiel as a whole, you'll see how that sort of pieces together. But this one's difficult because it's pretty specific. And so if you read through chapter 26, you'll see that it starts off sort of vague. It talks about, I'm going to bring up many nations against you, Tyre, and like the waves, crashing into the sea, and waves of the sea crashing into it, and it's sort of this general language from, I think, 26 verse 3 to 6, I think, and then starting in verse 7, it then gets specific, and it names the agent that Yahweh is going to use. And that agent is the very familiar, I'm sure, to most people listening, Nebuchadnezzar. And, Nebuchadnezzar...
Sorry, which verse was that? That's verse 7, is it?
Yeah, that's where it starts.
For thus says the Lord God, I will bring against Tyre from the north King Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon, King of kings, together with horses, chariots, cavalry, and a great and powerful army.
Yep.
Yeah.
And... this is if you just read it through on its face, not knowing anything about the history of the period, and you say, okay, what's supposed to happen here? I mean, you're gonna conclude, well, I guess Nebuchadnezzar came up against Tyre and leveled it, right? As you say, like, it's scrape it clean, tear everything down, and scrape it back to its original state. Because Tyre means like a type of rock, soar, the word itself. And of course, it's legendary, at least, origins, according to Josephus, I think.
I didn't know that. So Tyre literally means like a rock.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's supposed to be the two big, rocks out in the sea were sort of like fused together or brought together. And that's what Tyre was built on. And that's what he's saying, is that I'm going to just uncreate you, right? I'm going to take you back to your original state, scrape you clean. Even the dust, the dust is going to be, wiped off of you. And so, you would imagine that's, if this is prophecy, that's what you would see happen. And I think certainly this is what Ezekiel thought was going to happen. From a historical standpoint, Ezekiel had just seen Jerusalem taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and it was a bad scene, and likely sees that movement of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army going toward Tyre, and so says, you guys want to laugh at us? You think this is funny? Get ready, right? Because he's coming to your door now. And so this is what, like, if you read through some of the the early rabbinic commentators, that's what they envision, or that Nebuchadnezzar, this is what he did, right? Because that's what the text says. But of course, given archaeological, progression and historiography and what we know from Akkadian sources, we know actually that that's not what happened. Nebuchadnezzar it seems, laid siege to Tyre for about 13 years and never actually took it. And
That's a long siege, isn't it?
Yeah,
13
very
years.
much. Yeah.
Few weeks, you're like, this is going well, you know. Few months, bit bored of this.
Yeah, no doubt.
13 years. Oh, good grief, I want to go home.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? and this is what was so I think fantastic about it is that, you know, Ezekiel has this very, again, in your face prediction, and then the if you go to chapter 29, as I know you probably will, verses 17 to 21, it's Ezekiel writing 15 years later, and he's saying, the word of the Lord came to me. It's like, oh yeah, go figure. Because Ezekiel's looking around and going, Tyre's still there, and the siege isn't going on anymore. Oh, thanks, Yahweh. I know what's up now. Right? Let me tell you. Let me clue you guys into what Yahweh just told me.
And he very much overcorrects in kind of quite a funny way, which again you don't think about when you are a believer, because no one ever shows it to you. I mean, and why would they show it to you? You know, how is this going to come up in church or in the Kingdom Hall? These are the verses that are going to be kept away from you, and they're verses that only come to light when you bother to do. When you bother to see a different perspective on things. But let's go to Ezekiel 29, because with the 70 weeks prophecy we were talking about, Daniel chapter 9, you know, there you had a prophecy in Jeremiah that didn't come true, and the writer in Daniel is sort of trying to shuffle things around, and I think Dr. Carrier described it as a few mathematical gymnastics, and hey, we've sort of made it work. And, you know, that's one. The writers of one book kind of trying to make up for the writers of another book, but here you have what you're saying is the same writer correcting something that he'd said would happen. And if I can, is that a fair way of summing it up? I don't want to speak for you.
Progressive revelation. Progressive revelation.
Or new light. New light is how we call it in Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
So this is Ezekiel 29. I'm actually going to start off in verse 12. I will make the land of Egypt a desolation among desolated countries, and her cities shall be a desolation 40 years among cities that are laid waste. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the countries. Further, thus says the Lord God, at the end of 40 years I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples among whom they were scattered, and I will restore the fortunes of Egypt and bring them back to the land of Pathros, the land of their origin, and there they will be a lowly kingdom. It shall be the most lowly of the kingdoms. And it's really school ground. Not just a lowly kingdom, but the most lowly, if we're going to rank them, of the kingdoms. And never again exalt itself above the nations. And I will make them so small that they will never again rule over the nations. So a bit of an overcorrection, isn't it? Because again, that historically didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, their dad definitely didn't beat up the other kid's dad on the playground.
Yeah.
You know, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
But I think that's the difficulty with this, because as we've all experienced, I think, and probably we have all argued, is that if a prophecy does seem to come true, then we camp on it, right? Like, oh yeah, see, look at that. When it doesn't, then it's sort of, this is where apologetics comes in. And we say, okay, so how can we possibly understand this? And so there are two main ways that apologists and evangelicals will come at this this prophecy. One is like the more academic way. And the more academic way you can see in the writings of scholars like Chris Udd, UDD, or Robert Chisholm, and, amongst others. And they're making arguments like, what is prophecy? How does it function? And they'll look at things like, all right, let's go to the book of Jonah and look at the prophecy against the city of Nineveh. Well, this was a prophecy that Jonah comes and he says, hey, 40 days and Nineveh is going to be destroyed. But then they repented and they weren't destroyed. Like God sort of called off the dogs, right? And so, okay, maybe
it's been a change of plan.
Yes.
Yeah,
and so maybe what's happened is the king of Tyre, maybe after that 13-year siege, he was like, you know what? Hallelujah. Give him praise and glory in the house of the living God. I am a convert, right? I'm down with Yahweh now. And then Yahweh's like, that's all I needed. Call him off, right? And like, do we have any evidence of that? No, of course not, right? But this is sort of a prophecy is contingent. It's inherently contingent. And so maybe that's what happened. The king of Tyre somehow repented to God's satisfaction. Of course, the problem that we then face is that in chapter 29, as you've very clearly pointed out, and then he says, all right, so yeah, God didn't give Nebuchadnezzar Tyre, right? They worked really hard. Every head was made bald. Every shoulder was rubbed bare, whatever. But they weren't given wages for their efforts. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give Egypt to him and to his soldiers, and that will be their pay. But as you pointed out, that didn't happen either. And so, if you read through the work of these evangelical scholars, they'll say, well, I mean, I guess the king of Egypt also repented. And it's like, yeah, is that possible? I guess. But is this really the avenue that we should be going down, these sort of post hoc rationalizations to try to explain these things? Anybody that's reading this text is going to be like, all right, Nebuchadnezzar is going to take Tyre. Oh, he didn't? Well, obviously he's going to take Egypt. Oh, he didn't? Okay, we've got a problem.
I think Jehovah's Witnesses reason something along the lines of, it was the Battle of Carchemish, but that was clearly a battle that Nebuchadnezzar won. It's not the same as occupying Egypt and, the Egyptians being spread to the four winds. That's
and the Battle of Carchemish was earlier than that prophecy.
Right, yeah.
Like,
of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly problematic. But that's like the more academic way that they come at that, right? Trying to reason to it from a theological position. The online apologetic way of doing this is like the less academic way, is to try to read Alexander the Great into that prophecy. Now, I'm not saying that no academic tries to do that, but on the whole, like, I haven't found that to be terribly common. This is something that, the chapter of my book actually began as a response to a fairly popular YouTuber. You probably know him, Mike Winger, who does a lot of this sort of thing, and he's got a three-part video series talking about the prophecy of Tyre. And he, what they do is they make arguments getting into chapter 26 itself, and they say, okay, all right, there are two basic things that you'll see. One, well, look here, it says that many nations will come up against Tyre. Many nations. Well, that means it can't just be Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar is not many, he's one, right? So that's one thing. We need to be looking for Nebuchadnezzar to be the first wave to come against Tyre. And they sort of bolster this by looking down. I think it's down in verse 12 is where you see a shift where it's saying up to that point, he will do this and he will do this. But then it switches, I think, in verse 12 to, and they will ride through your streets, and they
will plunder your riches and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your fine houses.
Yep. And they say, aha, the shift in pronoun from he to they, it's subtle. Josh, I'll give it to you. It's subtle, but that's the transition from Nebuchadnezzar and his army to the they of the later nation that's going to come, namely Alexander the Great. And they'll try to point to things like, if you know anything about Alexander's siege of Tyre, one of the ways that he actually gets there is he destroys the mainland cities, many of the mainland cities, and takes the rubble and builds a causeway out to the city, which is what you see now. I think
it's still there, isn't it? Yeah.
The peninsula, the sediment is built up alongside of us, and they have like a pretty wide peninsula. But like even Alexander didn't destroy Tyre, but I mean, like it's a whole other thing. But so those are sort of the ways that they try to come at this, and I go through this in some painstaking detail in the book about how that's all rubbish, right? It's just from a philological standpoint, from a standpoint of the text itself, it just does not work at all. So
how do they reason? Again, verse 14: "You shall never again be rebuilt." How do they get around that?
Yeah,
apologist channels.
Generally, what I hear is one of two things. Well, that's hyperbole. I guess one of three things. That's hyperbole. It's like, it doesn't really mean that. Two, well, it's not the same city, right? The city that's there now, that's not the city that was there in antiquity. And so it's true, that city's no longer there. That one I don't hear as much.
Are you talking about, because if I just zoom out, I set as the backdrop, these are actually ruins. You can't really see because we're both in the way, but these are ruins of Tyre. They're talking about this city. So they're saying, they're talking about the part that's actually the ruins.
Yeah, it's not the same city exactly, right? And sometimes they'll even add in, it's certainly nowhere near as wealthy and as prosperous. And so in that sense, Josh, it's not the same city. And it's like, come on, guys. Like at what point are we just saying, maybe we should think differently about this?
Yeah.
But the issue here, and probably the worst argument that I've heard, was that it wasn't the island city that was supposed to be taken in Ezekiel 26. It's the mainland city. And there's a mainland city. The way that Tyre was set up is the island city was dependent upon its mainland cities. And there's one in particular that had this freshwater spring, and it's called the city of Ushu. And we see it in the textual record. We have a lot of Akkadian texts, a lot of Assyrian kings, New Assyrian kings, talk about their attempts to besiege Tyre. And I mean, we see several kings that do this. Sargon II does it. Sennacherib does it. Esarhaddon does it. Ashurbanipal. And they all do it the same way. They cut off the island city of Tyre through a blockade, usually along the mainland, to cut off Tyre from the mainland city of Ushu. And they do that because that's where the island gets its fresh water. That's where it gets a lot of its supplies. And if you stop them from getting to Ushu, I mean, they're in a whole world of hurt. Now where are they going to get their stuff, right? So life gets very, very difficult on the island when they can't come and get supplies from the shore. Now they can still do it because Tyre has a fleet, right? They can still go off in their ships or in their boats and go, get their supplies or whatever. There are also wells, probably cisterns and things that they dug to collect rainwater, that sort of thing. But so that they can stay, but it's no fun, right? It's no fun. But that's why they can last so long. but just in a lot of difficulty.
Yeah.
But like I've heard it argued that the mainland city of Ushu was what they laid siege to for 13 years, which is so much nonsense. And that they did so from every side except the side that faced the sea. Like for some reason, for 13 years, like Nebuchadnezzar didn't like close the loop, I guess.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that they tried to get in for 13 years, tried to get into this mainland city. And when they finally did break in, oh my gosh, they found out that all the people had snuck out the back door.
We forgot one of the sides.
Damn it. Something was wrong. And they're looking at their blueprints, and that's what we missed. It's like, okay. But I mean, you can go back, and I do it in somewhat painstaking detail, but you can go back and read these Neo-Assyrian kings who talk about how they laid siege to Tyre. And they that's the first thing they do is just go along the shore and cut it off. In fact, Ashurbanipal, that final king, he talks about how he was out campaigning other places. And at the end of his campaign, on his way back home, he stops and he conquers Ushu. Right? It's like the last thing he did on his way back, sort of as and he conquers
Been
Ushu.
there, got the T-shirt thing.
Yeah. So like this idea that Nebuchadnezzar and his mighty forces like lay siege for 13 years and can't take this little mainland city, like miss me with that shit. So again, lots of problems with trying to say that Nebuchadnezzar is not the only one that's supposed to go up against it, or that the language shows that he's the first, or that it wasn't actually the island city. No, listen, it was supposed to be Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't do it. Period. That's it. If you're going to make, some type of an explanation for this, it's going to have to be a theological one, which is why, academic evangelicals are coming up with those types of explanations. They're not saying things like, maybe this wasn't just about Nebuchadnezzar. No, it was. That's what Ezekiel thought. So
yeah, and again, the language is fascinating. Of the writer of Ezekiel just jumping through hoops to make these arguments. If we're going to kind of look at this from the point of view of whether the Bible is inspired by God or not, just get it right the first time. I'm not going to allow Nebuchadnezzar to succeed. I'm going to allow Alexander the Great to succeed, but it's not that it won't ever be rebuilt again, which would be an accurate description of what happens to Tyre, and a description that doesn't agree with what's actually written in the text.
Yeah, I mean, you would expect, and I know that people when they argue with theists, they will say this, and I think it's spot on, right? If you have an omniscient deity who's trying to make predictions, like maybe be a little more precise. Let's get some names in there, and then when you get those names and they're wrong, like let's own up to it and try to say, maybe we're not understanding this correctly.
Interesting. Well, this has been very, very enlightening. I feel as though we've kind of just about scratched the surface with what you have to contribute in terms of your many years of study on this. And my hope is, if it's okay with you, that we can kind of continue this conversation. Maybe not so much about what we've already discussed, but other areas of Bible prophecy and scholarship that my viewers will find interesting, because this is all stuff that I just didn't know as a Jehovah's Witness, and it's stuff that I've literally only learned. Not even when I started out as a YouTuber did I know this. That this is stuff that I've had to learn in very recent years. When preparing my rebuttals to, again, Jehovah's Witness propaganda. So it will be fascinating, if possible, to learn more from you and get more of an insight on Old Testament prophecies and what have you, if you're able to join us again in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to. And just sort of as a final word, to those that are watching that are maybe thinking, this guy, he's just an atheist. He's just looking to destroy the Bible or whatever. Number one, I left fundamentalist Christianity kicking and screaming. I did not want it to be wrong. It was the data that drove me away, unfortunately, and I miss it. Right, I miss my faith, frankly.
You really, in what way do you miss it?
I think having all the answers, and knowing that everything ultimately ties together in a way that the omnipotent deity is taking care of things, and having that security and knowing about eternity and all of those things. Like, of course, I miss. My family is still very much fundamentalist evangelical, and while they still love me, there's great disappointment, right? Which again, in their shoes, I would probably feel the same thing, because I remember what that was like. But I would say to that person that's thinking I'm just out to get the Bible or something, fine. Like, if that's what you want to think, that's okay. But what I would challenge you to do is go and actually look at what scholars say about these things. Go pick up some commentaries and just leaf through. Go to email me and I'll give you a list of evangelical and liberal scholars' commentaries alike, and just flip through them and see what they say on Ezekiel 26, because one of the things that you'll find is that they're all going to say, yeah, okay, I mean, it looks like it failed. And here's how we theologically explain that. And I think being able to confront the problems will either put you in a position where you say, ugh, man, I've really got to rethink how I interpret the text, or it's going to bolster your faith as it stands, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think that truth should fear investigation, and so I would challenge you to do that. So
Absolutely, and I do relate to, the very comforting feeling of absolute certainty that our beliefs used to bring us. But what's interesting is that I've never been more interested in and fascinated in the Bible than I am now. It's like, I can remember devoting so much of my time to attending meetings about the Bible and finding them incredibly dull. But when I actually bother to listen to what scholars like yourself have to say, I find it genuinely fascinating, and really enjoy learning more about it. So again, if we can do that more on the channel in the future, that would be amazing. I will just briefly go through some comments. Ephraim Rivera says, according to Bible apologists, God has the right to change his mind, making failed prophecies, not failed prophecies, but a change of heart. How convenient.
How convenient.
Yeah, God can do that, apparently. You just go back to square one. Natalie Sanchez says, he of the bow tie speaketh truth. Lots of love.
Are cool.
Lots of love in the comments for your bow tie, and I hope you don't mind me saying, but viewers, just before he came on, he asked if he should take his suit jacket off, and I said no, leave it on, because there's going to be lots of Jehovah's Witnesses hopefully tuning in, and this is exactly how a Jehovah's Witness would dress, so that's fantastic. Myth Vision podcast, our mutual friend, says, has Dr. Josh received any private emails from people who have read his book being blown away by any of the failed prophecies? Which one is your fave?
I don't. So the types of emails that we get, generally speaking, are thank you so much for providing a resource that allows me to have good conversations with my fundamentalist family, right? So actually in the beginning of volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook, I open with a story about sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and having just put a fork full of pumpkin pie in your mouth and having Aunt Francine say, how can you, say the Bible is wrong? Look at how all the archaeological evidence in Israel supports the Bible or whatever. And how do you engage with Aunt Francine? Or Aunt Francine, sorry, my wife is British, so I feel like I mix up my my pronunciations of the letter A. But how do you engage in a meaningful way? And instead of just saying, "Nuh-uh," what can you actually cite? And so that's what the atheist handbooks are for, is to be able to say, right, somebody says to you, "Hey, look, all the prophecies in the Old Testament come true 100% of the time," and you can say, "How do you deal with the prophecy of Tyre?" At being able to have that meaningful conversation, or to say to somebody, we should be following the morality set forth in God's law. And you say, oh, so we should have chattel slaves? And they say, no, it's indentured servitude. It's a welfare system. It's, like a basketball player, being sold as, his contract. You're like, oh my God. So, those sorts of things, I feel like I talk about them online, responding in emails, either supporting people. That being said, and then I'll shut up, but we got, I think, 10 emails last night within 15 minutes from one person named Jesus, not Jesus.
Oh, it's nice that he could write. I've been trying to get hold of him for the channel because people keep saying I should come to him, and I'm like, well, if he wants to come on the show, he's kind of my number one on my list. So yeah,
I know that we've had Raptor Jesus on at one point. But,
right? Okay.
Yeah,
but Jesus wrote you 15 emails.
Yeah, and
10. How many emails?
10 and 15 minutes.
10 and 15 minutes. Yeah.
And Megan fielded them all. But obviously telling us that we're leading people astray and we're wrong and those sorts of things. But
well, it was nice of him to drop by, because goodness knows lots of people have been waiting for him for a very long time. So
yeah, I've been waiting to come out this whole stream as a Christian, and now maybe this is the right time.
Yeah, wow. So thank you, by the way, Mythvision, dear friend, for your super chat. We have Joe Dalver. You got Dr. Josh on. Love him. He is awesome. I have to concur with that conclusion. Efren Rivera says, yes, part 2, part 3, and part 4, please. I think we're going to run out of prophecies, to be honest, but we'll do our very best. Joe Dalver says, Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. Get it. This is just, one way that people can reach you or have access to your research by buying volumes 1 and 2 of Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. How else can people reach you online?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have 5 books published now. There are 2 more coming pretty soon. I'm working on a second edition to Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery, which is going to go from about 200 pages to it's sitting at 606 right now. So I talk about that topic a lot, so I've got a lot more to say about it. But if anybody goes to Amazon and
spoiler alert, yes,
yeah, that has not changed. But if you go to Amazon and just type in Joshua Bowen, Bowen, all of our materials will come up. And we're on. My wife runs a channel called Digital Hammurabi, Hammurabi. You might know her. It's Megan Lewis. She is the host of the new podcast by Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Jesus. So it's just Megan and Bart on the screen each week. So I'm super proud of the work that she's doing there. She's a lot smarter than I am and much better looking, actually. So it's, it's a win-win for everybody watching. So,
fantastic. That sounds really interesting. I'll have to check that out. And finally, thank you very much indeed, Catherine Dominique, for your very kind and generous super chat. Thank you for this fascinating conversation. I found it fascinating too, Catherine. So thank you so much. Viewers, thank you so much for tuning in. We will hopefully have Dr. Bowen on again for similar conversations in the future, please do remember to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel so that you can enjoy them. But for now, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.